Recording started.
Good afternoon, and welcome to this Epic Ed Web Conference, Formative Assessment, a Fundamental Component of Learning. Epic Ed is sponsored by, or brought to you by, I should say, the Digital Learning Collaborative here at the Friday Institute of Educational Innovation on the campus of North Carolina State University, and COSN, the Consortium for School Networking. Epic Ed is a part of the Connected Educators project funded by the U.S. Department of Education. This afternoon we'll be using Blackboard Collaborate to bring you this session. Just want to take a moment to give you a sense of the interface. If at the point at which we take questions you want to use a microphone to ask questions, you notice where the talk button is. You'll click on the talk button to talk and then click it again to turn it off. Notice the polling features there that we'll mention to you in just a bit, the whiteboard tools, and then the chat box where you can ask a question or make a comment at any point in time. There are two ways you can ask questions during the session. Of course, at any point in time, on the right-hand side of the screen, you can chat a question in the chat box there. Our speakers this afternoon will pause periodically to see if there are any questions, or when they do pause, if you'd like to pose your question using a microphone, you'll notice the raise hand icon in the participants block that you should click and then be recognized. So we want to give you a chance to interact right away. We'd like to know where you're from, those of you participating in this afternoon's event. So if you would double click on the pencil icon that you see there in the whiteboard tools palette, and then perhaps choose a different size for that pencil, a different color, and mark your location on the map to indicate where you're coming from this afternoon. Give you just a few seconds to do that. And then after you've done that, go ahead in the chat box and type in the city and the state where you're located. We see Leah is actually here from Vietnam, so we welcome you here, Leah, this afternoon from Vietnam. Ann is from Greensboro, Georgia. Scott from Champaign, Illinois. I'm from Raleigh, North Carolina. Avon is from Aptos, California. Give you a few more seconds to chat in the chat box where you're located. Okay, great. Well, we welcome everyone to this afternoon's session. I want to remind you that the references for this session are located on the Epic Ed website. This is a URL I'd ask you to jot down now to take note of. We'll come back to this at the end, but if you go ahead and jot this down now, there are several articles related to today's session you can access from this particular URL. It is a bit.ly URL, bit.ly/epic083012, today's date. At this time, it gives me pleasure to introduce to you Keith Kruger of COSN, who will introduce our speakers this afternoon. Join me, folks, in a virtual round of applause and welcome Keith Kruger.
Actually, I think Barbara Cambridge is who I'm going to introduce, who is our moderator for today. Barbara?
Thank you, Keith, and thank you, Bobby, for hosting this event today. The Connected Learning Coalition is very pleased to be here and to have working with us Barbara Jones from UCLA National Center for Research and Evaluation Standards and Student Testing, and Peter Grunwald with Grunwald Associates. Keith and I, as you see on the screen, are both members of organizations that are part of the Connected Learning Coalition. The Connected Learning Coalition is made up of 6 different organizations, and you'll see they cross disciplines. We have career technical education, social studies, English, mathematics, science, and school networking, which are instructional technologists. And we are a group that has been meeting together for about 3 years in order to focus on the kind of integration of learning that we think is extremely important. We have devised a set of principles for learning, which you can find on that site that Bobby just alluded to, and which have been agreed upon by all of our organizations as foundational for what we do. One of those is assessing progress is part of learning. And with that principle in mind, our coalition devised a statement about formative assessment, which is the kind of assessment that we contend is most integrated into learning itself. And that principle is what we will be basing what we say today about formative assessment on. When I was an English professor for a very long period of time, I taught writing definitions. And one way to get at a definition, and in this case we're looking for one about formative assessment, is to think about what the word is not. And so we'll start with looking about what formative assessment is not. First of all, it's not an instrument developed exclusively by others outside the classroom. In my teaching, for example, I use one of the kinds of formative assessment called the minute paper, which at the end of a class I would ask students to write for a minute what's amazing what you've learned and what's something you're still puzzled about. I'd collect those minute papers, use them to devise what it is we needed to pay attention to in the next class. And in doing the writing, students were collaborating with me in figuring out what we already knew and what we needed to know. We didn't need anyone outside our class to do that. We were able to do that kind of important assessment of where we were with what we knew in the classroom ourselves. Formative assessment is not interim or summative assessment. Peter's going to talk about both those kinds of assessment in a few minutes. He will note that interim assessment, for instance, is something that is useful to a wide group of constituents, partly because it is something that can be done in a timely way. And he will talk a bit more about both interim and summative assessment in relation to formative assessment. But they are different, and that's our point here. And then thirdly, formative assessment is not an alternative to summative assessment as a method of rating learning. And in fact, formative assessment is not to rate learning. If it isn't doing that, what is it doing? Formative assessment is a process of learning used to identify what is known and what is not yet known. And a key word in that bullet is the word process. It occurs over time. It isn't a one-shot deal. It is something we're continually doing. A second key word is it's learning. Its objective is not accountability, but identifying what learning is going on and what learning needs to be attended to in the future. Formative assessment is scaffolding to support continuous learning. I always like to think of the word scaffolding as signaling something that is helping the construction of something. And in this case, it is the construction of learning. It is supporting ongoing learning. Thirdly, formative assessment is a feedback loop. Barbara is going to have a graphic about the feedback loop that is formative assessment, talk about it in more detail here. But I just wanted to highlight the word feed. Formative assessment is something that feeds or nourishes further growth or learning. And then lastly, formative assessment is reciprocal, a reciprocal activity designed by teachers and students as they teach and learn. And we ask the question always, who has responsibility for and freedom to do assessment, in this case formative assessment? And our answer to that is that it's teachers and students. So with this definition of formative assessment in mind, the Connected Learning Coalition recommends 4 different actions that we should take in education. One is that, or the first 2 actually, go together. When formative assessment is done on a continuing basis, it involves naturally emerging work that students are doing, not something extra or imported from outside, from somewhere else, but generated during regular teaching and learning. The third point is something that we have accentuated in CLC, the Connected Learning Coalition, because of course we're looking at how to work across disciplines. And our set of principles agrees on the centrality to all disciplines of those principles, including formative assessment. And we want to examine them to be sure that they are being supported. And then lastly, we recommend supporting collaborative professional learning. I'm going to leave this expansion of this point to Barbara Jones, who's going to speak next. And so Barbara, why don't you take over the microphone?
Thank you, Barbara. Okay, let's see. Do I know how to move the slides forward here?
So why don't I move the first one for you? It's up above where it says Connected Learning Coalition recommends 4 actions, and it's a little arrow in the lighted box. So I'll bring it down to your first slide.
Okay, great, thank you. So I want to reiterate a couple of the points that Barbara made about formative assessment being a process and not a tool. And that it is integrated into instruction, and it's not separate. It occurs while learning is taking place, and importantly, it comprises many components over a period of time. And I'm going to go into more detail soon. But one of the key points also is that teachers and students within a formative assessment classroom and framework are both participating, or all of them are participating in the different aspects of formative assessment in parallel ways. And one of the things this does is that it distributes the responsibility for learning among the whole class. So a lot of teachers may be reluctant in some ways to add on another assessment component because teachers are already really loaded heavy with putting time into assessment. But if there's work done up in the front to model to students the formative assessment process, to create a community of practice among students, then actually it becomes easier to run the classroom when you have distributed responsibility among the whole class, and students have more agency for their learning. And as an important 21st century skill, self-regulated and self-motivated learning is something that formative assessment helps to empower. Okay, so here is the diagram of the process of formative assessment that Barbara was alluding to. And I want to first bring your attention to the 3 green boxes on the left side. So it starts with learning progressions, learning goals, and success criteria for success. And what this is the work that the teacher does as part of the setting up a formative assessment classroom, is deciding what to be taught, but within the context of learning progressions. So this is sort of being able to tell where the student is in relation to a learning goal that he or she is going to set forward, but also within the context of the domain as a whole, and be able to track that student's progress. So the orientation of understanding where that learner is in relation to their own progress, and not necessarily in relation to others. And then as we move on, we get into eliciting evidence, interpreting evidence, and then from that you identify the gap between where the learner is and where they need to go. And I'm going to talk about that in more detail. From there, you take responsive action, decide if you need to give feedback to the student, you adapt the instruction to the learning needs, and you make sure, as Barbara mentioned, that you're scaffolding. And you're doing it sort of at the student's learning edge, right where sort of the next step is in the progression, right where they need to go. And because you're taking stock of their learning on a regular basis, this is easier to do within the context of formative assessment. And the goal is to close the gap between where the learner is and what learning goals you've set forward. And of course, the learning goals most likely are in relation to the standards that you're using and the curriculum materials that you have. Over here in the bottom right, we have classroom culture, and it talks about the 3 levels of assessment that occur in a formative assessment classroom. The teacher does the assessment, peers assess one another, and learners assess themselves. Okay, so what is the teacher's role in formative assessment? Well, here again, it's not focused so much on the behaviors of students, but on what they need to be learning. And it's about creating a transparent environment for students about what is expected of them and what they need to do to be successful. So we talk about success criteria. So that needs to be very clear. So students know exactly what elements consist successful work, and if they're not making that, what they need to do to get there. And then also, teachers need to gather evidence, as I said, on a daily basis. And often we're used to thinking of this in terms of a test, an instrument, but it could really be anything that the student says, does, writes, or makes. And it occurs largely in interaction that the teacher has with students, observations of their activities and their discussions, and then analysis of their work products. So based on this evidence that teachers collect, they need to take responsive action, because just gathering information, gathering data about where students are in their learning is not effective unless they do something about it. And so here they can continue instruction as planned if they believe everything is on track. They can revise their instruction. They can also provide feedback to students. And they can also delegate any of that to the students themselves. But one of the key parts of this in terms of gathering evidence is that teachers plan learning and assessment opportunities when they are planning their instruction. So they know where there's going to be opportunities to check in on students' learning. Okay. So what is the student's role? Well, the students need to learn how to self-assess, and this occurs mostly in the context of metacognitive activity. So besides being aware of what the demands of the tasks are they're doing, the goals of the processes that they're undertaking, they have to be having practice in checking what is my level of understanding, what strategies do I have to be able to move my learning forward. And these have to be taught, of course, by the teacher, and that's one of the main roles that the teacher has is teaching students how to do this for themselves. And they're also responsible for making their learning evident to others, to their peers and to their teachers, so that they can help them. And they need to give their peers feedback on how they're doing. So teachers also can play a big role in teaching their students how to give constructive feedback to help them. It helps both the person who's giving the feedback to their peer, because it makes them internalize their learning goals more closely, and of course it helps the peer. So here's a quote. I used to do more, but now I do less. Now I work hard to save time for student reflection, rather than filling every minute of the lesson with activity. So this is a teacher engaged in formative assessment, and it goes back to the point that it's not necessarily that during the course of a lesson that the teacher is working harder to fit in time for the assessment, but it's being delegated for the students. It's teaching them to be reflective based on a framework that the teacher has created. So one of the key aspects and elements of formative assessment is descriptive feedback. So there are two parts of it. So there's feedback to the teacher, and we've talked about this as evidence. So this is information based on gathered evidence that informs teachers' instructional decisions. And it also is important that as it comes in, it makes any other previous information that the teacher has irrelevant, because this learner's status has moved on. They have progressed and are in a different place. So the teacher needs to be getting regular feedback from the students about their learning status. And then, as we talked about before, it being a feedback loop, this is where that comes in. So there's the regular feedback loop of getting information from students and acting upon it. The other part is the teacher giving feedback to students, a peer giving feedback to students, or the student self-reflecting and giving themselves feedback. And an important part of this is there's been a lot of research about descriptive feedback and how important it is to student learning. But it's not just any feedback. It's not just, oh, you're doing great, you're doing good, or this could be better, or a grade. It has to be descriptive and clear. And if it has suggestions for how to improve, what possible future steps can be taken to brainstorm with the student about that, it's the most effective. Another key component, and this has been implied through everything else I've said, is that there needs to be a safe classroom environment for students to feel comfortable exposing where they are in their learning. A lot of students may be constantly comparing themselves to others, maybe not feel that they're up to par, but if they feel that if showing their learning is actually not only helping themselves, but is also helping their peers, and that they're working together in a culture of formative assessment practice, then that makes a big difference. And they won't feel necessarily that they will be diminished in the eyes of their peers or their teachers if they show something they don't understand, but feel it's a safe place to ask for help and maybe to help each other. So just in closing, some key points is that formative assessment is an actionable, reflective practice for both teachers and students. Participants regularly make adjustments to their practice based on evidence of learning in relation to learning goals. And that teachers and students both have to make their thinking visible for the purpose of moving learning forward for all students in a collaborative community of practice. And when we talk about teachers making their thinking visible, this is one of the key instructional strategies that teachers can use in modeling what they want students to be able to do. All right, so I will pass it on to our next presenter, who has some great things to talk about in terms of a recent study. All right.
Thanks, Barbara. This is Peter Grunwald, and I am going to talk to you today about a study and findings that were generated with support from the Northwest Evaluation Association, which is a nonprofit based, as you might imagine, in the Northwest, in Portland, Oregon. We conducted this study as part of a series of public studies that try to inform the field in regards to areas of high interest, and of course assessment is indeed one that is pretty critical. The study that we undertook actually was comprised of 3 parallel surveys, a survey of more than 1,000 K-12 classroom teachers, more than 1,000 parents of K-12 students, and 200 school district decision makers, that is administrators. In all 3 instances, what we tried to do, and I think we succeeded, is to create samples that were as representative as possible of the larger population. And as you can see on this slide, we took some care in terms of the demographic and other elements to make sure that the samples were as representative as possible, particularly in this case teachers and parents. But the same thing with district administrators, including elements such as district size. So what is it that we looked at? Well, we looked at formative, interim, and summative assessment. The notion here, of course, was to examine the perceptions of these 3 kinds of assessment types and to, in essence, bring in the voice of parents and educators, both teachers and administrators, into the process so that it would be possible to test, if you will, some of the notions that you've just heard discussed. And I think you'll see some interesting echoes. We did not use the terms formative, interim, and summative in getting feedback from parents or really from educators, what we did for parents is use fairly detailed definitions that you can see up on your screen. And for teachers and administrators, we use slightly less detailed definitions that were embedded in the questionnaire itself. So it didn't depend on a shared understanding of the terms formative, summative, and interim. And in fact, we found that there isn't a complete consensus among educators about what those terms even mean. I'm not going to read you the definitions here, but this is a sidebar from our public report, which is available at no cost for downloading, and I'll provide the URL at the end of this presentation. Using these definitions, let me get into some of what we found. First of all, as a building block, we found that when we asked both parents and educators what is the key focus that they have in terms of the objectives that they're interested in, the priorities in education. And no surprise, what we found from parents is that they are interested in their individual child. And the perceptions that parents told us is that it's not just the individual child, it's being able to monitor the child's progress and figure out when and if and when to intervene in their child's progress and in order to help things along. Same kind of thing in broad brush in terms of teachers and administrators. They are also interested in the focus on the individual child. And most of the results in terms of monitoring student performance and monitoring growth over time and the like are roughly comparable with parents and also between teachers and administrators. There were a few exceptions that are probably no great surprise to you. For example, monitoring teacher effectiveness was something of much greater interest to district administrators than it was to teachers. But using these findings about the importance of monitoring and tracking individual student progress, we then drilled down a bit and wanted to find out what is it that parents and educators wanted to assess. And what we found is that there's a picture that's actually different than a lot of the national dialogue, which of course emphasizes English language arts and mathematics and soon science as the focus of assessment. What we found is an interest in measuring a much broader range of skills, of higher order thinking skills, at a level that's roughly comparable to more traditional subjects, which I'll show you in just a second. So what you see here on the chart is that problem solving, critical thinking, communication, and even a little bit further down, creativity, innovation, collaboration, all those so-called 21st century skills were of interest, with problem solving, critical thinking, and communication being of particular interest to parents. So I think the takeaway here is a much broader view of what it is important to assess in terms of skills. When we look at traditional subjects, indeed English language arts and mathematics are important, but pretty much in the same at the same level of interest you see science, and not much further behind history, government civics, geography, economics, even arts and world languages, generating a fair amount of interest as the potential focus for assessment work. And this is true of both parents and educators. So, so it's, I think, fair to conclude that both parents and educators really are looking for assessments to provide them information on a much broader set of topics than just the traditional English language arts and mathematics. We asked our respondents, where should most of the decisions regarding what students learn, where should those decisions be made, since obviously that's part and parcel of the broader debate around assessment and how assessment results should be used. And what we found is that all three groups, parents, teachers, and administrators, were of the view that the majority of decisions should be made fairly close to the student, that is, at either the building or even classroom level. The one moderate outlier there, again, no big surprise, is that district administrators, there was about a third of them that said that the locus of decision-making should be at the district level. But frankly, we expected there to be a bigger difference between district administrators and parents and teachers. What we found is that a healthy proportion of all three groups looked for decision-making at a level that's quite close to the student. When we did look at formative, interim, and summative assessment, again, not using those terms, but using definitions to help inform our respondents and generate as sound a set of findings as possible. What we see is that formative is seen as being more useful in more different kinds of ways by parents than interim and summative. And that finding is echoed on a variety of levels when we heard from teachers and administrators. Again, these are essentially excerpts from our public report that you'll be able to look at in some detail if you're interested in the subject. But the basic takeaway is that across a number of dimensions, formative and interim assessments were perceived as being more valuable by educators than summative. The one exception is in terms of comparisons of student performance to students both in and outside of the district. But that was an interest that was at a lower level of intensity, I should say, than some of the other elements that you see here. So key takeaway is that the kinds of interim and certainly formative assessment that you've heard described by my fellow panel members is something that is seen as being quite valuable and important by both parents and educators. Now, one of the other findings, and I'm just giving you a very quick overview of some of the findings, but one of the findings that really jumped out at us is the whole notion of the shelf life of assessment findings. What is clear here as we look at what parents are telling us about when assessment data is useful to them, what is clear here is that it's most useful to them at most 2 or 3 months after the assessment actually takes place, and that after that it becomes stale. And in fact, there's a significant proportion of parents, about 40%, a little bit more than 40%, that tell us that assessment data is only really relevant up to a month after the assessment. And so there's some obvious implications here for what's going on nationally in terms of the changes in assessment regimes and the kinds of high stakes and standardized testing that's taking place, and the ability to be able to report back assessment findings both from summative and formative and interim. It's probably fair to say that formative and interim lend themselves to this kind of quick turnaround that parents want, perhaps more readily than does summative. But at any rate, takeaway would be very limited shelf life of assessment data, certainly in comparison to what's commonly assumed in our field. We also took a look at some of the trade-offs that are out there in regards to both time and money regarding assessment. And what we found is that, as this suggests, that there's a very significant proportion of educators who think that there's too much time teaching to the test. A smaller proportion, but still non-trivial, of parents believe that there's too much teaching to the test. When we look, by the way, at monies spent on state assessment, we found that both parents and educators thought there were too many resources being allocated to high-stakes state assessments. And there's a number of other trade-offs that we looked at, including issues such as stress and some of the newer technology platforms for assessment that you can see in our report. And with NWEA, we generated some implications and takeaways. I think that some of these are relatively self-evident from the data. One is to obviously focus on a much broader range of topics that ought to be assessed than just English language arts and mathematics. We do need to develop new ways to assess, given the preferences and the perceptions that we're hearing from both parents and educators. We certainly need not only useful but timely assessment, given that shelf life finding from parents. And it's pretty clear that decision-making authority needs to, at least on a number of issues, devolve down to the building and the classroom level whenever possible. And finally, while this isn't a direct implication, it's certainly one that we think is important, and that is the potential for learning communities to provide training and professional development for educators so that they can better use and implement assessments. And the model for that is the online communities project that we are working on with COSN and the Friday Institute as part of the initiative that's been developed by the U.S. Department of Education. As I mentioned, we have a public report and an infographic that's up on our website. You see here a picture of the infographic that is available for downloading that addresses some of the issues I just mentioned, and as well as some others. It looks like we're missing the URL, so let me just read it to you. It is at grunwald.com/reports. And Grunwald is spelled G-R-U-N as in Nancy, W-A-L-D. I'm now going to hand it over.
Peter,
yes.
Can I interrupt? One thing you could do is to put that URL in the chat space, which would spell it out for people.
I think it's just
Happy
been done.
to do that.
Thank you.
Aha! Excellent. Somebody is very quick on the draw. I think that's Bobby. Thank you.
Before,
let me, in fact.
Could I interrupt?
Go ahead.
In another way, sorry, but before we turn
Sure.
to Keith, there's something that just has really struck me that you and Barbara both emphasized, and that is that the timeliness of assessments is so critical. Barbara said, for instance, that as formative assessment is done, what we knew from a previous formative assessment becomes irrelevant because the student has moved on, the student is in a new place, and we need to be focusing on that. As a side note, it made me think about how wonderful that would be for a student who was having trouble, has made progress, and doesn't have to think about that previous gap in knowledge or whatever it was that showed up. Peter, you mentioned about the recipients of assessment data thinking so much about timeliness. I wonder if Barbara or Peter, you'd want to talk a little bit more about what we can do about this, and particularly in relationship to the time that it's taking in the classroom to prepare for summative assessments and our investment in summative rather than formative at this point.
Barbara, do you want to go first?
Sure. Just briefly, I would say that transparency is the key. That transparency between, and I mentioned this before, between the teacher and students about what the learning goals are, what are the steps to progress towards that, and then for the teachers and the students both to be checking on that regularly, I think makes a big difference in being able to see that progress, being able to take pride in that progress, and being able to have a learning orientation versus a performance orientation has really been shown in the literature to have great benefits for motivation and perseverance in the face of challenges. So I would say that would be a really key component.
Thanks. I mean, I don't have a lot to add to that. Certainly our data isn't prescriptive in terms of what it is that can best address the need for timely information. I would only observe a couple of things. One is that just as with educators' need for timely information, and both students and educators to be able to take the most recent information and essentially use it to paint a more accurate picture of the student's progress, I'll just emphasize that the ultimate consumers, that is the taxpayers and voters, parents, believe very strongly that assessment data needs to be fresh. And I'll leave it to folks with greater expertise in the implementation of various assessment types to think through how to best execute against that reality. My personal view is that that probably calls for a sort of moving, dynamic set of assessment tools that would very much include portfolios and electronic portfolios to be able to allow, as I think Barbara and both Barbaras have mentioned, the student's own work to, at least to a degree, speak for itself. But the key takeaway from our research is that clearly parents are very much in agreement about the need for much more rapid turnaround for assessment findings.
Well, and I think certainly Keith will now have a lot to say about what technology can do in helping us to generate and share information and evidence in a timely way. Keith?
Thanks, Barbara, and thanks to both Barbaras and to Peter for really setting the stage. And as Barbara Cambridge mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, this is being hosted by the Connected Learning Coalition, which is a coalition of 6 national educator associations, mostly teacher specialty associations, so math, science, English, social studies, career, and technical. But my organization, COSN, which are the district level technology leaders, it stands for Consortium for School Networking, have all come together to really work together and think about what should learning look like today. And on Monday, we did a chat, and if you're interested in the coalition, go to connectedlearningcoalition.org. I'll put that in the chat box so that you have that. But we did the coalition issued about a year and a half ago principles for learning, and as we were thinking about how to actually implement or focus on some of the key issues, formative education, formative assessment was one of the major things. And what I want to focus on, since I come from an association that thinks about technology for learning, is what is it unique today that we're able to do that maybe we couldn't do a few years ago. And there's no question, as everyone knows, we've had a huge focus on high-stakes tests, on data-driven decision-making. Yet, if you think about the world as it is, an awful lot of opportunity, a lot of data is collected. And if we step to the kids' world outside, or students' world outside of school, they're often playing gaming environments. And I like to think of gaming as, in fact, a high-performing learning environment. Everyone starts at level 1. You answer questions until you get level 1 right. You move to level 2. You don't move to level 2 until you get level 1 done. It doesn't take you. It keeps moving you as fast and as deep as quickly as you can. It doesn't take you back to the lower levels. So I have a slide up there which talks a little bit, though, that it's not like we don't have technology in the classroom to actually collect formative data. It's been drastically increasing in recent years. The Institute for Educational Services, or IES, puts out their practice guide for using student achievement data to support instructional decision making, and they specifically recommend that technology systems really do support data-driven decision making and allow us to more actively engage students. And the graphic that's here is, one way to think about that are, in fact, the sort of, and these are not representative of all the ways that formative data is now collected, but for examples, the learning management systems that school systems have increasingly allow for feedback loops to both the teacher and students in peer learning situations. We have up there student response systems, what are commonly generically called clickers, that give immediate feedback to the teacher, and it especially for shy students is a very great way to allow them to participate, and you can, as the teacher, see what the group is thinking as they're not just calling on the kids that volunteer, but seeing what's happening. We're also seeing what we've labeled here as teacher and student handhelds. Those are increasingly being allowed as districts rethink their acceptable use policies, and they of course provide immediate feedback to teachers and students on what they know, and increasingly interactive whiteboards that are really becoming very pervasive in many school systems allow students to demonstrate that they know and can collaborate really with their peers. And it also allows teachers to save student notes electronically within the whiteboard that can inform the instructional planning. And of course, these are only a couple of the examples. We're seeing many ways that you can enable formative assessment with things like data dashboards, vodcasting, and handhelds, allowing for the creation of voice and video recordings. We've already had a question, in fact, regarding, well, where do you get kind of information about this? And in fact, I see it comes from Ann Ware, who's a project director for COSN. But we've done a lot of work over recent years with superintendents, and the goal has been to kind of really understand what is it that the key educational leader for the school system is trying to accomplish. And we've identified 5 major themes that nationally superintendents care about, and creating balanced assessments is one of them. And in fact, when we asked them among the 5 priorities to rank their very highest priority, this was the one that was the #1, which is, I think we've heard this in a variety of ways in the survey data that Peter's provided. We have an awful lot of focus on these high stakes accountability. How do we move to a much more robust, balanced assessments using formative data to really provide feedback to the learner and the teacher to really improve instruction? COSN, for the last decade has been thinking about data-driven decision-making, and I have to say, when we started our 3DM project, when we asked people 10, 12 years ago, are you doing data-driven decision-making, only a handful of hands went up. When we ask that question now, virtually every hand goes up. And the problem is that, of course, what people leap to is, are you collecting things in your student information system? Are you looking at high-stakes tests? So we really have to get much more nuanced about how do we use data to much more deeply inform the instruction process. And one of the things that we're doing, and I want to get to questions, but we're working with the Gates Foundation. They funded an effort called Closing the Gap, Turning Data into Action. And it's a partnership with the Superintendents Association, AASA, as well as Gartner, the world's largest IT consulting firm. And part of that is really helping school systems think about both the the traditional kind of LMS and SIS, Learning Management System, and Student Information Systems. How do we provide better data to about the satisfaction or dissatisfaction with the current products in the market? But I think even more interesting is the work that COSN and the Superintendents Association is doing around how do you enable a environment that is data rich. What is the role of principals? What is the role of the school system in really helping teachers and students have access to this data, and how do we move beyond the current products that exist in the market and really articulate what the educators want and need from those sort of systems. So with that, I'm going to turn it. Oh, I will also say one last thing, and that is this whole area of personalized learning. I think is front and center for many school systems. The race to the top of competitive funding that is just happening this fall, the next month, school systems have to figure out whether or not they're going to apply for the race to the top district competition, is focused, in fact, on personalized learning. And when we look at things like the Horizon K-12 report, which looks at opportunities with emerging technologies for learning, things like using data to inform instruction is a key trend that we're going to see building over the coming months and years. So with that, I'll turn it back to Barbara.
Keith, what you just said makes me think of a question about the word data. I'm thinking back to the beginning of this webinar where we're talking about the centrality of teacher voices and student voices and their reciprocity in talking together about how the learning is going and what needs to be changed in the way of instruction or student activity in order to move learning forward. And I don't think students will use the word data. I don't think they'll see their work as data per se, but probably as evidence. That might be a term that they could take up and think about it as evidence of their own learning. Do you see the word evidence as being able to be substituted for data in order to bring the conversation among the various constituents in assessment together in a better way?
Well, I'm not sure. I'd have to think about whether the word evidence is the right word, but as you were talking, it reminded me of a week ago Sunday, Fox News did a 1-hour special, and they highlighted Mooresville School District in North Carolina. And I loved the segment that they had where they interviewed a little boy, I think he was in, I don't know, 3rd or 4th grade, and he talked about, how he knew where he was and where he was going. He had a sense of what he didn't know, and when they asked him sort of, are you confident you're going to learn it? He said, "Oh, I'm going to learn it." And I think feeding back that information to what I would call the consumer of education, the learner, is critical and is absolutely where we're going to see us moving the needle on student achievement.
I think that's really true, and Peter mentioned one vehicle for that, which is the electronic portfolio, in which students do post their work, all sorts of kinds of work that they do, artifacts, or as some people call them, the assets of their learning, and they have some control over looking at it, analyzing it, sharing it or not sharing it. So I think there are numbers of ways that we have to do what you just said, and to foster more children who can do what that little boy could do. Are there others who have questions? You can post it in the chat. You can raise your hand by clicking the hand icon, or if you are one of the people participating as a leader of this webinar, you can ask it by clicking the talk bar. Anyone else with a question? It can go to everyone or to a single person on the leadership panel.
Barbara, hi, this is Bobby Hopgood here at the Friday Institute. I just wanted to make a comment to extend on some of the things that were said this afternoon about students getting feedback. And I think it's important for us to remember when we're talking about learners today, a lot of people want to characterize them as digital natives. And whether you believe in that concept or not, there is a lot of research that indicates that a lot of our young learners today value immediate feedback. And hence we then understand why they gravitate towards games like Angry Birds. I saw Ann Ware posted in this chat box Angry Birds because they do get that immediate feedback. So I think it's incumbent upon us to remember that what's happening outside of the classroom, the ways in which technology are providing and shaping their lives, we can capitalize on inside of the classroom. So in Keith's example, talking about Mooresville, North Carolina, they use a learning management system there so that students can see at any given point in time where they are on a learning trajectory, and it develops that sense of onus in the learner so that they feel like they have a lot more control. And that's something that we know that they value. Why are video games and those sorts of interactive games so engaging? Well, because they get that feedback and they feel like they have a sense of control over where they're going. So I think it's important in this conversation for us to keep in mind that, as Keith mentioned, there are so many technology tools available to us today that can provide that immediate feedback for the learner and for the student, and that those connections are so important because it takes what's happening outside of the classroom and brings it into the classroom.
That just made me think about something inherent in video games that I think could be capitalized in the classroom, which is that when you're doing video games, failure is low stakes. So you may die over and over again or whatever equivalent to that, and you keep trying. You have perseverance. There's no judgment about making mistakes. And so creating that, again, that safe community where our students are interested inherently in learning versus perceptions of their performance, and care about taking big chances sometimes, and not just taking tiny chances, because they're excited about what could happen with what they might find out. Sort of like in a video game is kind of an exciting parallel to capitalize on.
Taking chances, very important. Knowing that risk and not succeeding are both part of the learning process, and we certainly need to take that into account when we're assessing. I just saw the report of a faculty member who has as 5% of the grade in his class talking about your failures. So I think that being willing to acknowledge that part of the learning process is really important. So thanks, Barbara. I really agree with you. I put up now the screen that gives you the citation that Keith mentioned just a moment ago, which is connectedlearningcoalition.org. If you go on that site, you'll see some information about the coalition, but you'll also see a place that we would invite you to ask any further questions if you have them after this webinar. You will see the name Jan Bray, who's an executive director of one of the organizations, and we will commit to discussing with you whatever you'd like to discuss regarding formative assessment. So we thank you very much for being a part of this webinar today. We hope that you've learned something, that you have been stimulated to think about your own practice and the practices that you would like to support at whatever level and in whatever role that you have. So thank you very much, and thank you, Bobby, for hosting us.
My pleasure, Barbara. Many thanks to Barbara Cambridge, Barbara Jones, to Peter Gunwald, and to Keith Kruger. My apologies earlier for putting Keith on the spot for starting things. We really appreciate the information shared this afternoon and the presentation about formative assessment. I want to draw your attention to the chat window. place the URL there where you can access resources related to this session from Margaret Heritage, also from Grunwald and Associates, the report that Peter shared with us, as well as connectedlearningcoalition.org, that website, and grunwald.com/reports. I want to leave you today with a glimpse into the near future, some upcoming events via the EPIC-Ed online community. We just finished today this web conference. Starting in September, Dr. Lisa Hervey here at the Friday Institute will begin a special series called Teacher Feature Fridays, the very first one looking at the concept of a highly connected educator and what is that highly connected educator. Also in September, we're missing one item here, and that is on the 11th of September, the second in our series, One Size Does Not Fit All, Two Perspectives on Digital Transition. We'll host a web conference with the superintendent of Tucson, the Sunnyside District, school district there, as well as the assistant principal, from Asheboro City Schools, as we take a look at digital transition in two different environments. Then you see there on the 19th of September, discussion of the National Ed Tech Plan with Karen Cater and the superintendent of Mooresville City Schools, Graded Schools rather, Mark Edwards. In addition, a number of upcoming webinars from our partner communities, EdWeb on the 27th, another teacher feature, a couple more teacher features, and we'll be adding as we go along. So we invite you to visit the epiced.org website to take a look at our events section, and if you're not already a member, to join in the conversation about digital transition. Again, a virtual round of applause and many thanks to representatives from the Connected Learning Coalition. Our thanks to Barbara Cambridge, Barbara Jones, Peter Grunwald, and Keith Kruger. Thanks so much, everyone, for participating this afternoon, and we wish you all the best for EPIC success and EPIC conversations in the coming year. Thank you, and have a good afternoon.